This part of my analysis will address lines 103 to 167 of The Moose by Bishop. This is an excerpt of about 60 lines, and this is the kind of length of excerpt you can expect if you get a section of this poem for your IOC. So I'm just going to go ahead and give a quick overview of my understanding of this passage, and then I'm going to talk about the techniques. Okay, so this part of the passage, this part of the poem rather, occurs after the speaker of the poem has kind of moved away from the coast on this bus and is now kind of sitting in the dark on the bus as it moves through the landscape at night. Before the passage in question begins, we see a lot of description of the kind of talking that she overhears, kind of familiar conversations. She refers to in line 91 as an old conversation, not concerning us, but recognizable somewhere back in the bus, grandparents' voices, just kind of talking about things that people talk about. And what follows after is a passage in which we see in a very comfortable way the people on the bus gossiping or just kind of commiserating or sharing experiences of pain, and the overall mood is pretty somber but comfortable at the same time. Clearly, she feels somewhat at ease here as she listens to these conversations, and so I'll take you through this. She mentions in line 103 deaths and sicknesses, the year he remarried, the year something happened. She's recounting here all of the conversations that she overhears. What's striking about this section is how focused on the negative a lot of these people are. In line 105, she died in childbirth. That was the son lost when the schooner foundered, when the ship sank. And then in line 108, he took to drink. Yes, she went to the bad, and it goes on and on. And then in line 114, we see the stanza talking about the acceptance that a lot of this bad news gets. Clearly, people are taking some comfort in sharing these pieces of gossip, either from their own lives or the lives of others. And in line 120, she begins to imagine how these people were now on this bus talking the way that they talked in the old feather bed, peacefully on, dim lamplight in the hall, down in the kitchen, the dog tucked in her shawl. So here the speaker seems to be thinking about what these folks looked like when they were in their normal environment, and the image here is one of comfort and familiarity. I don't know if she's talking about herself or if she's talking about family members that she knows, or if she's talking about just these people in general and what she imagines their normal lives to be. But either way, the image is very comfortable. And then at the end of this section, in line 126, she says, "Now, it's all right now, even to fall asleep, just as on all those nights." And we almost see her drifting off to sleep, comforted by the human companionship around her. Even though she doesn't know these people, she feels like she's part of their lives and part of a known community that she can join. So I'm going to back up and talk a little bit about the techniques in lines 103 through 127 or so. So one thing that we see a lot of is enjambment. In line 106, we see also an example of the kind of irregular rhyme scheme that this poem features quite a bit of. We see remarried and happened, and not much else rhymes in that particular stanza. we see a repetition of the phrase the year, anaphora. I'm not sure if it has any particular significance except to kind of emphasize the repetitive, predictable nature of the communication she's listening to. Interestingly, in line 108, it says, he took to drink, yes, she went to the bad, and then we see the first name when Amos began to pray, even in the store. It's a strange story, but I guess she's talking about mental illness of a particular Amos. Not sure who that is. I'm not sure she does either. But what's interesting is we see a rhyme scheme begin to emerge here. It's irregular, but it's perfect rhyme. She went to the bad, which rhymes with had. When Amos began to pray, they put him away. And it's almost ironic because she's describing things that are anything but perfect. But the rhyme scheme is there, and Bishop does this throughout the poem. She kind of chooses when to rhyme and when not to, and there isn't really a predictable rhyme scheme, but there are little moments of what we would call euphony, or good sound, created by these rhymes, and that's typical of the poem too. This is a poem in which we see these little moments of life that bring her joy, and this whole poem is really a recollection of a moment and a series of moments in a journey, and it's an overwhelmingly, or a generally positive poem in which the speaker is lost in a reverie, kind of picking and choosing scenes that seem to bring her happiness, and so I guess the irregular rhyme scheme connects to that. Also in the next stanza, beginning with line 114, yes, that peculiar affirmative, yes, she's just reporting speech here, and reporting the sharp indrawn breath, half groan, half acceptance, the kind of language she would hear somebody using, or utterance somebody would use when showing sympathy. And what strikes me in this one is, in this stanza, is in line 119, in parentheses, how she mentions, we know it, like we know life, but then also in the parentheses she says also death, and it seems almost flippant, like an afterthought. And I'm not sure if she's commenting on just kind of the insincerity of some of this conversation, that people are talking about something like death, or thinking that they know what life and death entail without really engaging too much with the person with whom they're speaking. But it seems like she's kind of exploring human conversation and what we really talk about when we talk about the sorts of topics we see in this section. Do we talk just to talk, or do we talk in order to find true connection? She seems to question the limits of the sincerity here. But again, there's a certain comfort here, and when she says in line 120, talking the way they talked in the old featherbed, this, like most of the pronouns in this section, is vague. Who are they? We don't know. It could be anybody, which to me suggests a kind of universal quality to these kinds of conversations, and this kind of comfort in human companionship, however imperfect. In keeping with that, we see a lot of imagery in this section of comfort, featherbed, the dogs tucked in a shawl, and the asyndeton here kind of provides us with a jumble of comforting images that we can pick and choose from. And in the last lines, I think I mentioned, now it's all right now, even to fall asleep, she seems to be bringing us into a moment where she is falling asleep, literally, as she speaks, because she, I think, feels so comforted and so safe in this traveling world of the bus, with these humans sharing their experiences with each other. And then, of course, suddenly we see this abrupt change, the dash, and then the abrupt change. Suddenly the bus driver stops with a jolt, turns off his lights. We see these short lines, stops with a jolt, turns off his lights. The rhythm becomes bump, 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 bump. We get broken out of the more predictable rhythm and syntax in these last two lines. They're much shorter than the lines before them, and that underscores this feeling of suddenness and of a feeling of abruptness and alertness as the bus stops to consider the moose. Now, there's a pause here suggested by the break in stanza. After, in line 131, turns off his lights, there's a break, and then all of a sudden we see emerge from the poem, just as it emerges from the forest, a moose, which has come out of the impenetrable wood. And I can't help but to see a metaphor here. The wood, the forest, described as impenetrable, suggests a world outside of the everyday lives of the people on the bus. It is a metaphor for the unknown, for the natural world that this bus has been kind of flying by. And it seems like the people on the bus have essentially not, they're just kind of taking their worlds with them based on the conversations they're having. And here all of a sudden they're shaken out of that comfort by the appearance of this beautiful, majestic creature. Well, maybe not beautiful, but certainly majestic. And I love how Bishop creates this sense that there's a creature from another world standing before them, as she describes it as looming above them, and all of a sudden a world has opened up to them, symbolized by this moose. And then there's an exchange here as the moose approaches the bus, and it sniffs at the hot hood as if she is kind of checking this bus out, trying to figure out what it is. And I just love the lines of that spondaic last line, the bus's hot hood, the alliteration there. I'm not sure what purpose it serves, but it's a very blunt and interesting image. In the next section, we see much more description of the moose. It's towering, antlerless, high as a church, homely. So there's almost there's a bit of a towering, antlerless, dactylic meter in that first line, high as a church, dun 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 dun, again the same. But I think what is most noteworthy here is the diction. She compares this creature as towering, so we get the sense of the size and the fantastic nature of this moose. It's high up above them, but it's high as a church and homely as a house. So she's comparing it to familiar things from her world, a church, a house. And this parenthetical statement, or safest houses, the word safest houses is a kind of a phrase used to describe safe investments. The speaker here is trying to make sense of this creature in ways that make sense to her, using familiar comparisons, churches, houses, as if she resists being brought into this world. She has to use normal, conventional language and comparisons because she's unable to express it any other way. And then, kind of underscoring this idea, we in the last two lines of the stanza in 143 and 144, a man's voice assures us, perfectly harmless. There's this voice of human authority reassuring everyone that this kind of blast from another natural world is not to be feared, because I think their first reaction is fear and awe. Now, in the next stanza, she says, some of the passengers exclaim in whispers, childishly, softly, sure are big creatures. So we see that rhyme again, creating more nice sounds, more euphony. But we also see some sibilance there. The S sound is repeated here as this hushed feeling of awe permeates the entire bus. And we get these little bits of dialogue as people respond in different, not particularly enlightening ways. They're big, they're ugly, or she's big, she's ugly, it's a she. It's like they are not quite willing to be drawn into the same spell as the poet, and we see her reaction maybe compared with theirs. And then we have this moment where she's finally looking at this creature, taking her time. She looks the bus over, grand, otherworldly. The diction there of something grandiose, something big and awesome. There with otherworldly, grand, and then we see this line. Why do we all feel this sweet sensation of joy? More sibilance there with sweet and sensation, and then we see this repetition of why, kind of like the why we see in the filling station. And she seems to be struggling here to articulate the joy that she feels upon seeing this moose, and doesn't seem to have a good answer to it. And she seems content to just let the feeling of joy take precedent and be the main feeling that she experiences here, which is okay. Then the alliterative "curious creatures" begins the next stanza, line 156. The quiet driver rolling his R's. I'm not sure why she included that detail. I'm not sure it's from Scotland or if that's a regional thing, but she's I'm not sure what she's doing with that, to be honest with you. But you know, the curious creatures thing is just this final judgment that the bus driver utters. And then I love this line, "Look at that, would you?" I'm not sure if that's what he says, but I like this. This is a quote that is a throwaway line, like, "Look at that." Wow, imagine that. But really, if we think about it, maybe we could read it as a command that Bishop offers us. You know, look at that, would you? It's almost begging us to take the time to look at something like a moose that comes out of nowhere, or something like that moose coming out of nowhere, and it's a command for us to pay attention, kind of like a lot of her poems command us to pay attention to aspects of our world that we normally ignore. And then almost impatiently, the driver shifts gears, and we see the shifting of gears is almost literal, right? I mean, it is literal. He's shifting the gears of the bus and getting ready to move on. But there's a mental shifting of gears too, as we see this moment end and the bus move on to its journey, and the people return to their worlds, and the moose return to its own world. And there's a real sense of bittersweetness and sadness almost in this last stanza for a moment longer, and then there's a space kind of indicating a pause. And in the next stanza, "By craning backward, the moose can be seen on the moonlit macadam." That nice use of alliteration, "moonlit macadam," underscores the beauty of this moment as she looks back and sees this moose being left behind in the moonlight, in its element, but not quite in its element because it's standing on the pavement. And then that's all she's left with. And then, except there's a dim smell of moose. I'm not entirely sure that they can still smell the moose, or if the moose's smell was so powerful that it came into the bus. I think we might want to read this more metaphorically, that there's the whiff of the moose and its memory about them in this bus. Kind of the last trails of this moment, the last remaining feelings that they got after this extraordinary vision from the natural world. And then sadly we see her return in line 166 to the human world, as she notices that there is, all that remains is the smell of moose, but also an acrid smell of gasoline. You know, gasoline, I personally like the smell of gasoline, but the smell of gasoline juxtaposes the smell of moose. It's very much of the human world. It makes this bus go. It brings it away from nature. It's, you know, fabricated element, and very much reminds us of the industrial world that gasoline and oil power. So there's a sense of melancholy here as she realizes that she's back to the known world now. She's away from this mystical exchange with this creature and back to the everyday. So that's my understanding of this last section. You might have gotten something else out of it besides that. Hope so. If so, great. Look forward to hearing about it in your response journals. Bye.